Hi everyone, welcome back to PolyCloud YouTube channel. In this video series, we are covering the Microsoft Azure Administrator, that is AZ-104 certification, one of the most in-demand cloud certification in the industry. I will walk you through every Azure services from virtual machine storage and networking to identity management, policy and cost optimization with real hands-on demos and clear explanation. Complete series is designed to help you understand core Azure concept in depth, master real-world administrator tasks, prepare confidently for AZ-104 exam, and build a strong foundation for your cloud career. The best part is this entire course is completely free of cost, available end to end here on PolyCloud. I will also be uploading more Azure and DevOps and cloud courses soon. So please support the channel by subscribing and helping us to reach our first 1000 subscribers. It really means a lot and keeps this free learning going. Let's dive and explore Azure one service at a time right here on PolyCloud.
As an Azure administrator, you will need the skills that allow you to manage Windows and Linux virtual machines, or VMs, giving your organization the flexibility of multiple virtual operating systems without the cost and maintenance commitments that come with additional physical hardware on premises. In this course, I will begin by discussing virtual machine configuration settings in the Azure cloud. Next, I will deploy Windows and Linux virtual machines using the Portal, the CLI, and PowerShell. Next, I will enable Secure Shell or SSH public key authentication to Linux VMs, and I will use Azure Bastion to manage VMs using their private IP addresses. I will then attach and encrypt VM disks. I will create a virtual machine custom image, and I will configure a virtual machine scale set. This course can be used to prepare for exam AZ-104, Microsoft Azure Administrator virtual machines. You can also use templates to deploy and manage virtual machines. We then have the notion of an Azure Virtual Machine scale set, otherwise referred to as VMSS. You don't have to configure this, but it's used with load balancing configurations. You can enable auto scaling, which means when things get busy beyond a pre-configured threshold, then virtual machines are added to accommodate the increased workload. That's called scaling out horizontally. Doing the opposite or removing VMs when things quiet down is called scaling in horizontally. So we can do scaling out and scaling in. But when you configure a virtual machine scale set consists of multiple virtual machines. Each of those VMs needs to be the same. It needs to be based on the same OS image in Azure, whether that's a standard marketplace image or a custom one that you've created. You might also consider using spot instances with your virtual machine scale sets because a spot instance uses extra compute capacity available to launch VMs at the time at a reduced cost. Finally, we have a screenshot of capturing a custom virtual machine image. You might deploy a virtual machine in Azure based on a standard marketplace image, let's say Windows 11. But then you might tweak it, configure it in a very specific manner, install tools and apps on it, and then want that saved as a virtual machine image so you can deploy others from it. So this is possible once you have a VM deployed in Azure and configured accordingly. In this demonstration, I'm going to be deploying an Azure virtual machine using the Portal. Many ways you can deploy virtual machines. You could use Cloud Shell and access the CLI or PowerShell commandlets. You can also use the CLI or PowerShell commandlets locally if you've installed it in an on-premises computer. You can use templates to deploy virtual machines. We're going to do it all here in the GUI. So when you have a small number or a number of unique settings for a virtual machine, this method makes the best sense. So here in the portal, I'm going to start in the left-hand navigator by going to my virtual machines view. Virtual machines will be shown here. We don't have any yet. So I'll choose the Create button. And because I want to do this manually, I'm going to choose Azure Virtual Machine as opposed to Azure Virtual Machine with a preset. Can specify the subscription it's tied to. I only have one subscription, and the resource group it will be deployed into. Either I select it from the list or I could choose to create a new one. I'm going to deploy this in the HQ resource group. It's going to be a Windows-based virtual machine in this case, so I'll call it Windows Server 1. I'll deploy it in the East US region. I could also specify that I want the virtual machine to be replicated to multiple availability zones within a geographical region. This gives me additional high availability, but in this case, I'll just leave it in one availability zone. The security type is defaulted to Trusted Launch Virtual Machines. If you need advanced security features like virtual TPM and secure boot, that type of thing requires this to be set as a Trusted Launch Virtual Machine. Otherwise, you could also choose the Confident Virtual Machine option with additional hardware support for security, or just go to the standard basic level of security, which I'm going to do because when you select Trusted Launch Virtual Machines, some features aren't available. Now, certainly advanced security features are, but some things like working with backup won't work, not allowing the same normal access of working with managed disks associated with this virtual machine. So that's why I'm going to choose standard. For the image, I'm going to leave it on Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition. However, from the list, we can choose whatever we want. And if what we want isn't in the list, we can go to See All Images. We can really filter through exactly what we want. We could also, in the left-hand navigator here, filter it out, maybe by virtual machine images that include developer tools within the OS. However, I'm going to click the X in the upper right. We'll just leave it on Windows Server 2022 Data Center. The next important part of deploying a virtual machine is selecting the size. This is vertical scaling, either up or down, depending on whether you are increasing or decreasing the number of virtual CPUs, the amount of RAM. Naturally, more power means you pay more when the virtual machine is running. However, you need to select this so that it aligns properly with the workload you expect to run in the VM. You can change this after the fact too. I'm going to leave it on the standard DS1 V2 size. And for the Windows operating system in this virtual machine, I'll have to specify credentials in the form of a username and a password. Down below, it's going to open a public inbound port, so visible from the internet, allowing access to RDP 3389. From a security perspective, unless the server needs to be publicly visible, that's not the best security option. However, for now, we're going to do this because later we'll secure it using Azure Bastion, which is a jump server solution. If you already have an existing Windows Server license, you can use that here and you'll receive a discount for the price you're charged when running the VM. But I don't have that. I'm going to click Next. You're always going to have an operating system disk here, but down below you can choose to either create and attach a new disk. These are virtual disks, which are stored as their own resources here in the cloud. Or if you already have managed disks, you can attach them here. So these are like data drives. I'm not going to do that though, and I could do that later if I wanted to. Next, we can either select an existing VNet, a virtual network where we want to deploy the virtual machine, or we could create a new one here. I'm going to create a new one, Windows VNet, and I'll accept the defaults for the IP address range. This is a private IP address range that is not routable over the internet, so 10.2.0.0 with 16 bits in the network mask, and it's going to create a default subnet that uses that range. I'm okay with that for this example. I'll click. It's going to assign a public IP address resource to this virtual machine. For now, that's okay. I'll click Next Management at the bottom. Won't be changing anything here. I'll click Next Monitoring. I won't be changing anything there, or under Advanced or with tags. So that takes me to Review and Create. Just doing a quick little validation based on my choices. It says validation. Okay, let's deploy the VM, and it'll be up and running. It'll start it automatically by clicking the Create button at the bottom. Okay, it won't take very long before the deployment is complete. So we can click the Go to Resource button to go right into the properties of the new VM. We can create another VM. Of course, at any time, I'll just click the X to close that. We can go to our virtual machines view from the left-hand navigator. And of course, we can always access our manually deployed VMs. Deploy managed services, an example of which would be like a managed Active Directory domain in Azure. While there are underlying virtual machines, because it's a managed platform and you didn't manually deploy the VMs, they will not show up here. But this is manually deployed, so it does. Notice, of course, the state of the virtual machine indeed is that it is running. If I click on the virtual machine name, it takes me into the properties where I have a number of configuration settings. I can go back and change my network settings, my disk settings, the size, and we'll be working with that later on, all of these different types of things. The other thing to be aware of is if you go in your left-hand navigator to the All Resources view, when you deploy a virtual machine, you're deploying more than just a single resource in the Azure cloud, deploying the virtual machine resource itself for sure. But based on our selections upon deployment, we also have a public IP address resource, a network security group to control traffic into and out of virtual machines. We'll talk about that in detail later. I've got my virtual network interface. I've got my OS disk. And remember that we made a virtual network, of course, while we were doing the VM deployment. So we also have that. So you get a number of resources deployed in your subscription. In this demonstration, I'm going to be deploying a virtual machine using the Azure CLI. I'll be using the CLI as we've been doing here through CloudShell within the portal. So let me go ahead and fire up CloudShell to get started with that. Seeing how we can deploy virtual machines using the portal GUI. So why would we want to do it here through the CLI? It seems like it would be more complex because you have to know the syntax. Always remember though, when you do things at the command line, you might A, be more comfortable with it and prefer it, or B, you might want to put statements in a script that you can invoke at any time as a form of automation for doing things like deploying virtual machines. So here in the CLI, I'm going to start by typing AZ find, and in quotes, I'll put VM. So I'm looking for any command line syntax examples that will provide me a hint as to how to use the syntax. So we've got a couple of things here. AZ VM deallocate, but those are not necessarily the commands that we need to deploy a VM. So let's clear the screen. Let's put AZ find VM create, guessing that that would be part of the syntax. And sure enough, our second example here, AZ VM create dash dash name. So the name of the virtual machine as it will appear in the subscription, dash dash resource dash group. Of course, the resource group it's going to be deployed into. And then, of course, the image dash dash image. Yes. Right. What's the OS image we want to use? There are many, many images available. So, how do we figure that out? Well, let's start by going in the portal and taking a peek, because when you're going to create a virtual machine in the portal, one of the many things you specify, of course, is the operating system image. It might even be a custom image you've captured, but we'll do that later on in another demo. Choose from the drop-down list of images. These are just a handful of common ones. I could also click See All Images, and I could filter the list based on anything I'm interested in, or simply scroll through and browse all the variations of Windows. And of course, down on the left, you can also go to the various categories. For example, if you're interested in databases, so virtual machine images that already have database software installed, you've got a bunch of variations on Microsoft SQL Server, an Oracle database, a data science virtual machine for big data analysis, a MongoDB server, so plenty of options. That's great, but how do we do that from the CLI? Let's go back to the CLI. I'm just going to cancel out of creating the virtual machine, and I'll go back into the CLI. First thing I'll do is run AZ VM for virtual machine image list, and I'm going to specify dash dash output to control the output format. I want to see it in it. Okay, so we've got some variations of Linux like CentOS, Debian, OpenSUSE Linux, SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, Windows Server variations, version 2022, Data Center Edition. But if we want to, we can filter that list of OS images even more. This time I'm going to run AZ VM image list dash dash location East US. There could be a variation on the OS images available per region. Dash dash publisher is Microsoft, so I'm only interested in Microsoft images. Dash dash offer Windows Server. Okay, now I'm being more granular. I only want to see Windows Server OS images. Dash dash all dash dash output table. It's going to be a big list, so be prepared to wait a moment. So now we have the output only for Windows Server OS images. And it's a big list. Notice we've got some Windows Server 2019 also showing up. So let's pare it down or get more granular once again. So I've used the up arrow key to go up through my command line history. I've brought up the previous command, but what I've done is added to it --skew 2022. I only want to see Windows Server 2022 types of OS images. All right, so now the list is showing us Server 2022. It's a much smaller list because that's all that we are seeing in the command line output. There's nothing here related to Server 2019. So that's how you can find out the name of the OS image. Next thing we have to do is actually deploy a virtual machine. To do that, the syntax I will use is AZ-VM create --resource group HQ --subnet. I'm going to deploy this into subnet 2 --vnet name within vnet 1 --name. Now you should have some kind of a standard for naming things like virtual machines, really for naming any type of resource in Azure. So I'm going to call this WinServe 2022-1 --image. I've copied one of the references to an OS image from our previous command line output. Notice that each section of that OS image reference is separated with a full colon. For example, Microsoft Windows Server, Windows Server, 2022 Data Center Azure Edition, and so on. Then I'll use --public IP -skew standard. I just want a standard public IP assigned to the VM for now. --admin -username. I'm going to use username cblackwell. --admin -password. I'll just specify a password here quickly. If you're going to put this type of statement in a script, of course, you don't want to hard code these type of initial passwords at all. And finally, --location is East US to deploy this virtual machine using the CLI. All right, after a moment, it returns some JSON output, and it looks like the power state here is set to VM running. Let's go check our work in the portal. So if I go to the portal and go to the virtual machines view, sure enough, there it is, WinServe 2022-1. Indeed, it is up and running, as is the normal state of a VM that you deploy. If I go back into the CLI, we can also check VMs by running AZ-VM list --query space open close square bracket .name. That'll return only the names, and our Windows Server 2022-1 VM shows up in the list. In this demo, I'm going to take a look at how we can deploy a virtual machine using The first thing I want to do is get a list of virtual networks or VNets, because one of the things I have to specify with the VM when I'm deploying it is the VNet, more specifically the subnet into which it will be deployed. So I'm going to start by running get-az virtual network, and I'm going to pipe that to select name. I want the name property, comma, but I also would like the location property. Let's see what we have. Okay, here's our VNets. I've got a VNet called VNet 1. It's in East US. Okay, that's where I want to deploy my virtual machine. But the next thing I have to determine is the OS image that I would like to use when creating this VM. I'm going to run git-command, and I'm going to use *VM image, guessing that that's part of what is in the commandlet names, because as an example, here's a command that we can probably use, get-azvm image. That's exactly what we're going to do here. More specifically, I'm going to run get-azvm image offer -location East US -publisher name Microsoft Windows Server. Press enter. Okay, so we've got a couple of variations on Windows Server operating systems for .NET, upgrades, just plain old Windows Server. So let's take that commandlet one step further. I'm going to use my up arrow key to bring up the previous command and add a few things, such as -offer Windows Server, and I'm going to pipe that to select, and I want to select the SKUs property. When I refer to an OS image, I have to refer to all of these parts of the name, and the naming is very specific. So for example, 2022-data center-small disk, or variations of the data center edition, but with container support, application containers. 2019, Server 2016, wow, going all the way back to Server 2008. Okay, so now that I have a sense of how to figure that out, what the OS image is, I'm going to clear the screen. Here in the Microsoft online documentation, I've simply searched for new-AZVM. This is a great way to determine what you can use for command line parameters when deploying a VM. And as we have in the list here, there are a lot of items like the security group name, the image, even the size of the VM, the underlying horsepower, whether we should have a system assigned managed identity created. If it were Linux based, the --SSH key name parameter. Any additional user data we want to pass along to the deployment with -user data. Whether you want hibernation enabled for the VM, which really means that when you hibernate it, it remembers the state of everything that was happening when it was running. So when you fire it back up, instead of rebooting as it normally would, the VM takes you right to where it was when it entered hibernation mode. The point is that there are plenty of command line options available here. And in the online documentation, of course, we can read about how to use the commandlet and ultimately get to the point where we have command line examples. Here they're using a number of variables to store all of the individual parameter values. And so when they are calling new-AZVM, they are specifying a lot of the variable names here on the command line. And in preparation for creating a virtual machine, I'm first going to use the get-credential commandlet, which is going to prompt me for credentials, which will then be stored in a variable in memory here in PowerShell called $creds, but it will be stored as a secure string, not just plain text. So $creds equals get-credential. So for user, specify a username of C Blackwell. I'll put in the password I want to use for that account, and I'll press enter. So if I just type $creds to see what's in that variable, I know the username is C Blackwell, but we've got a secure string stored here. It's not revealing the password. This is a good thing. So I've run the next commandlet, which is new-AZVM. -resource group is HQ. Then I got a space and a back tick symbol. That's not a single quote, it's a back tick. You can usually get that on your keyboards towards the upper left of your keyboard. Then we have -name. I'm calling this WinServe 2022-2. -location is East US. -virtual network name is VNet1. -subnet name, subnet2. -security group name. I'm going to refer to an existing network security group that already has rules in it to allow RDP traffic. It's called Windows_management_rules. The next parameter, -image, and here in quotes is where I've referenced what we were looking for in previous commandlets, looking for the name of the OS image. So here, it's Microsoft Windows Server : Windows Server : 2022-data center -Azure -edition : latest. That's the one I want to use. -open ports. I want to make sure port 3389 is open for RDP, remote management traffic. And finally, all I'm doing here is passing it our $creds variable that we set up earlier. Now it says no size value has been provided. That would be the virtual machine size, the underlying number of virtual CPUs, the amount of RAM. So it says the VM will be created with the default size, and it specifies the name of it here. And that's fine. I can always change that after. But if I know I need something more powerful right from the beginning, then I should specify the size on the command line. Down below, we have some returned output for what has been created, a new virtual machine, of course. So we're going to check our work, first of all, in the portal. I'm in the virtual machines view, but I'm going to click the refresh button. And there's WinServe 2022-2. If we go back into PowerShell, we can also run get-azvm -resource group name HQ, and it returns back our virtual machine. So in this case, we've got WinServe 2022-2, among others, being shown in the list. In this video, we're going to talk about two topics. One is going to be redeploying a virtual machine. So what would lead you to the point where you conclude that should be done, and what does it do? And the second thing we're going to look at is moving a virtual machine. Sometimes you might deploy a virtual machine and then later realize you would like to move it either perhaps to another subscription, or maybe to a different resource group, or perhaps to a different region. So let's examine these. First things first, here in the portal, in my left-hand navigator, I'm going to go into my virtual machines view. So I have a number of virtual machines, but bear in mind that the virtual machine, of course, has to be running when you attempt to connect to it. Otherwise, you can select it here and start it up. Now, there might be times when, despite the fact that the virtual machine has been running for a while, all of a sudden you can no longer connect to it. Everything is as it was when it worked before. There's no changes to network security groups or route table entries or anything like that. Sometimes things just don't work and need to be redeployed. It's kind of like a user laptop or smartphone that's just been on for too long, and sometimes you just need to restart it. So as an example here, if I go into one of my virtual machines, in its left-hand navigator, I can scroll way down on the left to the help section, where I will find an option labeled redeploy and reapply. Now, those are two different things. We're focusing on redeployment. The reason the redeploy button is grayed out, of course, is because this VM is not running. If we were to take a look at a VM that is in a running state, so I'll open its properties, do the same thing, scroll down under help, redeploy, reapply, redeploys. Reapplying tries to reapply the state of the VM if it's not functioning correctly. So if it's showing as being in a failed state in the virtual machines view, and you can't seem to stop or start it, then you can try to reapply it by coming here. But you can also redeploy it. As it says here, what it will do is migrate the VM to another physical hypervisor host in the data center. Sometimes that's what you need to do to correct connectivity issues where you just can't seem to reach the VM and nothing else seems to be the problem. So if I click the redeploy button, up in my notification bar area, it has begun redeploying the virtual machine. You're not going to get any options for which host it should be moved to or anything like that. This all happens in the background. But this is really considered to be a troubleshooting step. You normally wouldn't do that. Moving. In the left-hand navigator here in the portal, if I were to go to the resource groups view, I could then click to open a resource group like HQ, and down below, I have all of the resources deployed into this resource group, including bear in mind that the virtual machine also might be referencing a network security group. It certainly will have at least one network interface and at least one disk. It might have a public IP address. So there are a number of resources to consider. Now, you could select these types of resources here in the resource group properties. You could then click the context button, the three-dot button in the upper right here, and you could choose to move the selected items to another resource group, to another subscription, even to another region. And when you do that, let's say I'll choose to another resource group, you would then choose the target resource group, in this particular case, where you want those resources moved. There's another way of doing this in the portal. If I search the search field at the top here for the word mover, we've got an option here called Azure Resource Mover, where on the Getting Started page over on the right, down below, I can move resources across subscriptions. Now, some larger enterprises might have more than one subscription, maybe for different administrative teams, or if it's a large organization that's multinational, maybe each country has a subscription. Or you might have a subscription for your production cloud environment and another subscription for testing and configuration. Either way, you can move resources between subscriptions if you choose. When I choose Move Across Subscriptions, we specify the source and target subscriptions and resource groups. In the same way, if I were to choose Move Across Resource Groups, you would choose the source and target subscription and resource groups. And you would proceed through the wizard by clicking Next. So at this point, it says Resources to Move, and you would add the resources by clicking the Add Resource. But notice here, all I'm getting is a list of 2 storage accounts. Well, what about virtual machines and other stuff? Well, that's because if we cancel and go previous, those are the resources that exist in the source resource group. So if we choose a different resource group for the source and specify the target again, go to next, add resources. Now the list includes many different types of Azure resources. And of course, if we close out of that, we can also move across regions. Maybe you've deployed a VM in one region, but realized you would prefer it to be in another region where it's closer perhaps to the admin team, if that seems to make a difference with network latency. We specify the source region, of course, the destination region. Maybe I'll choose Canada East. So source is East US, target region is Canada East, next. And then down below, I would click the Select Resources button, and I would choose the items that I want to move. Let's say we want to move all the resources related to our Ubuntu Linux virtual machine to the target region. I'll choose Done. They're now on the list. I click Next, and on the review screen, I would choose Proceed. And on the review screen, I would acknowledge that I am moving to a different region with this virtual machine, and I would click Proceed.